No hugging your friends, and I'm talking completely consensual, touching, any sort of contact would be completely banned.
When were you told this?
So this would be, like the occasional camp, or like one of the schools, they had this sort of sexual assault seminar, and they were sort of raising awareness of it, but it became a little bit misguided because they basically said, well, you can't have any sort of physical contact with your friends, let alone, anything beyond that. So then it kind of just became a joke because, well, when it's taken that far without any real idea of what issues it's actually trying to address, it sort of becomes a huge joke to the entire student population.
How do you get around that, Brent? I mean, is it as simple as this? If you're having an intimate encounter with somebody, you need to ask and ensure, do you want to keep going? Are you okay?
Yeah, look,
is it that simple?
Well, it can be. It can be. And I think that the point that Avia makes is a valid one, that it's not so much the message, it's how it's presented. And it's the same with drugs and alcohol and even mental health discussions where they bring people into schools. It's only as good as the person presenting it, and it needs to be backed up by work done before and afterwards.
So if you go into a school,
yes,
and you say to a group of boys, we're going to talk about consent, do they understand when they have consent?
Yeah, look, they do, but I think, the whole issue of consent is if you ask people, even people our age, to define what the legal definition of consent is, many would struggle. And one of the most important words in consent law that I focus when I talk to young people at school is the word freely. Kids will often be told or take on board that if somebody says yes or somebody stops saying no, that is consent. It's a very simplified version of consent. The word yes doesn't appear in any legal context of consent. The most important word to say is, or to think of, is not so much what somebody's saying or what they're doing, but are they doing it freely? And that leads on to a chat also about communication. I was talking to some Year 12 boys last week at a school, and one of the boys said, if you are having an intimate interaction and you take things to a slightly higher level, if the girl that you're with doesn't say anything, how do you know whether she's consenting or not? And it was a really genuine question. And the answer for us perhaps is simple in saying, well, maybe just ask.
Yes.
Don't
ask her.
Yeah, don't assume that she may be consenting because she's not saying anything. Assume that she may not be, so ask. And I had a couple of guys come afterwards, really nice young blokes, and that was a bit of a revelation to them. Like, would it be cool to ask? Would that be okay? Of course it would be. So consent can be a very complex thing if we get into the legalities of it, but it can actually be a very simple process as well. My view is explaining to the young people what consent is legally, but then bringing it back in a sense that they know how to identify it. And communication, I think, is a really big thing for young men and for young women. I'm often asked, what if I'm with somebody and something starts happening that I'm comfortable with? What's the best thing to do? The best thing is to articulate that. And if we have two people communicating rather than two people assuming, I think we're taking a step in the right direction.
Ian, I'll come to you in just a sec, but I just want to go to Christine and say that your daughter had sex ed today. Not that you needed it, but a high-level discussion around consent.
Just by sheer coincidence. And the thing that she found actually quite upsetting about the whole thing was that the girls were in a room all day talking about consent while the boys were in a different room talking about healthy diets or something like that. And so the feeling for the girls was, well, is this really an issue just for girls? I mean, this is an issue for boys as well. Now, I'm assuming that there will be a discussion with the boys at some stage during this week, but the girls didn't feel that, and they felt the onus is back on them to actually write the rules around this, and that this needs to be a discussion that the boys have. And in a way, is this a discussion that boys and girls can have together so they understand both sides of where each other is coming from? So I think that there needs to be a coming together here and an understanding of both sides in this story.
Ian, if I can turn to what Commissioner Fuller was saying, which was, stark comments saying that historical allegations of rape, the police are often stumped. And we've seen a debate in this country around several incidents now where it's either the complainant wants to do something and you've got sufficient admissible evidence for the police to move forward, or, in a sense, well, what can be done? That's it.
Well, I think what we're seeing here is the limits of a focus on criminality.
Right.
If you focus on criminality and what can be proved on a court, that obviously leaves a scope wide open. In fact, the earlier comments about education that's not backed up with what are the clear implications, legally and socially, for actually not having informed consent, need to be much clearer. The idea of speaking to boys and girls separately is dumb and dumber. I mean, this is a transactional kind of set of issues where actually everyone needs to know, okay, what are the social limits? What is really required? But I think much clearer, and what I worry about in the current situation, is an even more narrow definition of what is criminal or what can be proved in a court, as distinct from what is entirely unacceptable and may well be pursued. I mean, boys in particular need to know the limits. They need to be clear about what is not acceptable, not implied, not it's okay. And clearly the whole sense of many women's rage at the moment is that lots of people have gone far too far without consent in the past, with no sense that there might be any ramifications from that.
But I remember reading in the Respect at Work report that was produced by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, in March last year, and it talked about addressing historical complaints and having a disclosure process that helps historical workplace sexual harassment matters to have victims' experiences heard and documented to promote recovery. Now, you know, as somebody dealing in mental health, is that a substitute for criminal action, for criminal prosecution?
Well, they're not the same thing. So one of the issues, and you see this in civil cases all the time, of recognition, a different legal standard being required, as distinct from what is required in criminal situations where you require a conviction and there are then harsh penalties on the balance of probabilities versus beyond reasonable doubt, etc. So actually, in terms of recovery of people who've been in these situations, recognition, and you see this in civil jurisdictions all the time. So at the moment, at the government level and the police level, we seem to see a focus on that very narrow definition of criminality with the highest standard of proof, as distinct from recognition of what has happened to many people in different situations, which needs to be acknowledged, and also the wider ramifications. If 1 in 5 women in Australia are reporting that they've been victims of sexual violence, that's an horrendous number, and the mental health complications are large. So there is, I think, a national awareness that arises, and we shouldn't get lost on a narrow definition of criminality at the highest standard.
And just quickly, if I can, Brent, you're giving these talks daily.
Yeah, about 1,000 students a week.
And often young women are triggered by these conversations and come up to you. What happens when they come up to you? Yeah,
look, I always insist when I'm speaking. I was speaking to a group of young women at a school today, a girls' school. I was there all day. And, you know, there are the triggering points in my talk and my experience are when you start to explain to these young people the definition of consent, but even more so, the definition of sexual intercourse and how that is defined legally as opposed to a biological definition. And it's a few of those pieces of information that can be extremely triggering for young women who, without trying to simplify it, can often at that moment suddenly realise that what has happened to them last week, last month, last year is in fact a sexual offence.
So they were distressed about it, but they weren't able to identify it.
Yeah, or they go to well-meaning friends and say, hey, this is what happened. And so they're seeking legal advice from 16 or 17-year-old girlfriends or friends, which is well-meaning and well-intentioned, but usually right out of sync with the law. And so I always insist in my talks that there are teachers present, that we'll have the school counsellors present, because sadly, every talk I do, there are young women who are very confronted by this, and some will leave. And as long as we have staff there to support them and to move it forward from there, then in essence, I think it's a good thing that we're having this discussion. It's awful that it can be upsetting for some of the young people that hear it, but there's an indication that it's bringing things to the surface which they can now speak about, and they're identified within the school as a young person who needs some support.
And suddenly we're having that conversation more broadly as well.
Yeah.
As you've heard, these discussions can be really difficult to have. If you need to call anyone, speak to anyone, call Lifeline 13 11 14 1800 RESPECT or 1800 737 732. It's easy to become cynical about International Women's Day. Almost 100 years after the day was first marked in Australia, we've come to recognise the tropes, the breakfast attended by the Prime Minister, the hashtags, and of course the studies that show just how distant gender equality remains. Today we've heard from the Grattan Institute about the unequal economic recovery currently underway in Australia, because when COVID hit, women lost more jobs, took on more unpaid care work, and were less likely to be eligible for government support. So, almost a century on from when the militant women's movement of the Communist Party of Australia held a rally in Sydney's Domain to mark the event, we've got to ask the inevitable question, how far have we really come?
Another happy land girl has landed happily at Burcott Lodge Farm School in Buckinghamshire. To start a course that will make her a
blowing reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B.
Don't be too polite, girls. Don't be too polite. Show a little fight, girls. Show a little fight.
I am a woman, hear me roll. In numbers too big to ignore, and I know too much to go back and pretend.
What men mistake for happiness was in fact patience. And now women are beginning to feel that patience is not the answer.
As the 80s are developing, the women's movement is much bigger. It's the biggest that it's ever been this century.
Equal work deserves equal pay.
For more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by Professor of History at La Trobe University and author of You Daughters of Freedom, Claire Wright. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Ellen. How are you going?
Very good, and a wonderful day to be having this discussion with you on International Women's Day. We were having a debate in the office about what makes change. Take us through a jaunt through history. Does rage fuel change? Hashtags, quiet diligence, writing submissions to the national wage case on equal pay for women. What makes change?
Well, I think you'd say that fundamentally collective action makes change. You've got to have those strong individuals who become the kind of figureheads of a movement that people can get behind, who can be inspiring through their words or their actions. But fundamentally, it's collective action. And International Women's Day is a wonderful time to remember that, because it's really important to remember that when International Women's Day started in 1911, it was actually called International Working Women's Day. And this was absolutely a day of protest. It was a day of grassroots political activism from an industrial sense for women coming together to protest unequal, unfair, unsafe conditions in their workplaces. And we can lose track of that because International Women's Day, as you're suggesting, has really become quite a kind of corporate hallmark greeting card, little purple ribbon on the badge, that kind of performative allyship with women that belies its roots as being part of a socialist organisation. And it really wasn't until 1975 that changed. So I think that rage is really important. People coming together is really important. But it's collective action with, importantly, a really clear agenda that is what makes fundamental change.
Avia, this is a terrible question without notice to put you on the spot and ask. Who are those inspiring leaders for you, and do you think there's a clear agenda right now? So who are the inspiring women at the top of this, at the leadership of this movement, and is it clear what the agenda is?
Look, I mean, I think to reduce it down to just one single agenda would be misleading, right? I mean, obviously you've got the overarching goal of equality in the end, but along that way you've got all these other smaller steps, and you've got women who exist at the intersections of many different kinds of discrimination. So, for example, women of color or trans women. So then I think each of those needs to be addressed in a very intersectional way without pretending that every woman's struggle is going to be the same, right? And I think for me, the inspiring women that I looked up to would be, of course, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, young women who are using their voice and their platform to enact real societal change and sort of speaking truth to power by calling out politicians, by calling out how much further we have to go in terms of real impactful change.
And that's really interesting that you point to those two, because they're not saying, I mean, other than saying climate action or equality, but they're making a very detailed critique of the lack of action on climate change that is very accessible for people about what needs to change, and a very detailed assessment from Malala about what are the conditions that ensure that in lots of parts of the world and for lots of women they are very much second-class citizens. But they're not exactly saying, and here's the blueprint, here's the piece of legislation, are they?
Yeah, I think because to boil it down to one single solution would be, sort of overlooking a lot of the intricacies. Because a lot of the, like with climate change, right? A lot of people wouldn't consider that a feminist issue. But since we live in a patriarchal society, a lot of the burdens of climate change are, of course, going to disproportionately affect women and other minorities, right? So I think when they're pointing to these issues specifically, where there's been such a gaping lack of action, it's sort of calling on the politicians themselves to make the change, the people at the very top.
It's an interesting one, Claire. If you sort of look at the equal pay case, right, and you say, well, that was, among other people, Edna Ryan, and annual awards are named after Edna. She retires from the workforce, she becomes a member of the Women's Electoral Lobby, and she sits down, presumably at night and presumably without the benefit of a computer, in 1974. And she says, well, here's the submission to the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission of 1974, basically saying why women should have the same wage for the same work, pointing out that, dear sir, there are solo female breadwinners in Australia and you might like to consider that point. And the whole matter turned on that. And so sometimes I wonder whether you need that sort of intricacy, that sort of detailed work to affect change.
Well, I guess one of the most famous cases for equal pay was Zelda Deprano, chaining herself to the front of the Commonwealth Arbitration buildings in 1969, holding up her equal pay sign. It's become one of the most iconic images in feminist history in Australia. And it is that sort of inspirational action that galvanises people. And I think that's what those things do. They galvanise people. They become symbolic. They don't necessarily lead directly on to the legislation that's going to change, but they can really spark a movement. And that's exactly what happened in 1969. It was really at the forefront of the women's movement, the second wave women's movement. And the whole Women's Liberation Front came in behind Zelda Deprano and the women who were working with her along in those campaigns. And equal pay became a kind of arrowhead in the debate. But equally, equal pay was part of the agenda of the first wave suffragists. The women who were part of those first widespread International Women's Day demonstrations across Europe in those years, in the 1920s and the 1930s, equal pay was on their agenda. And we still don't have it now. This is unfinished business. I think this is one of the things that we have to, that studying history keeps reminding us. There's no one single moment where things change and they change irrevocably. There is progress and there are many, many setbacks along the way. And then we also start to consider perspectives that weren't previously involved, like our much more enlightened version of what feminism means now, a more inclusive, excuse me, a more inclusive debate that's bringing in what's now sometimes called the double glazed glass ceiling. We're familiar with the glass ceiling, but what does it look like if your race or your gender or your sexuality doubly locks you out of those positions of opportunity and of power? So we have to continue to grow and to change within movements to even problematize the notion of woman, but at the same time recognize that ultimately it comes down to power and who has it.
Yeah.
And what we see over and over again is that Men have the majority of power and they don't want to give it up, and they're not going to give it up without a fight.
Christine, I read some research. The Sydney Women's Fund in 2018 found almost half, 48% of women surveyed, 17 to 75, in Sydney said they were earning less than $34,000 a year. Less than $34,000 a year, half of women. How might this rage we're talking about, this tidal wave that Brent talks about, be marshalled in support of those women?
Well, it is really difficult to know, because what I read today was female graduates, from the moment they start work, are earning 20% less than their equivalent male counterparts. 20%, university graduates. So there is a lot happened since the 1920s, but clearly not enough to get our really smart graduates over the line earning similar money. So where is the answer there? I mean, Labor has come up today and said, well, companies should be forced to disclose their gender pay gap. It's a small thing. It's not going to get us there, is it?
Claire Wright, thank you for leading that conversation. More questions as ever on International Women's Day. Claire Wright is a historian at La Trobe University. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Ellen.
Before we move on, we need to tell you about this year's Young Australian of the Year, Isabel Marshall. It's estimated that more than 800 million women and girls worldwide struggle to afford menstrual products, a phenomenon known as period poverty. In her final year of school, Isabel and her best friend hatched a plan to change this and tackle menstrual stigma more generally. They took a gap year to develop their business, Taboo, shipping ethically sourced organic pads and tampons across this nation. As well as donating their profits to period poverty projects in Africa, they've also engineered a novel subscription service for sisters in need in Australia.
There's so many centuries of stories that people have told that have put menstruation in a really negative light. Periods are a very physical sign of being a woman, so it's an easy thing to target. I personally think that periods are so incredible. I think that every month it's a sign that your body is healthy and doing these amazing things and evolving constantly. And at the end of the day, it's creating an environment in which life can grow, which is miraculous. Why wouldn't we celebrate that?
It takes a lot of fineness if you want to come to our website in order to donate.
We actually started Taboo because of being inspired by the social enterprise model. This is in year 12. Eloise and I were so taken with this concept of taking advantage of markets and consumers that pour millions of dollars into these products that they need on a daily basis, like necessities, like bottled water, like toilet paper, like pads and tampons. But then instead of that money going just back into the pockets of people who are already successful or the owners of these companies, it's translating it to funds that can fund related projects. Some have found themselves in emergency care because of experiencing domestic violence and having to flee their residence. Some are schoolgirls who constantly have been flagged by teachers that they come to school without product. And generally, we're in contact with these schools because the teachers contact us and say, look, I've been having to fund 10 girls in my class who otherwise wouldn't have pads, so I give them to them in class, but I can't keep doing this, it's not sustainable. Is there a way that you can be involved? So when we started this journey, we noticed we had a lot of people interested in our product and being involved and taking part on a monthly basis through a subscription, but they didn't actually need the product for themselves. So we thought, okay, why don't we marry up these two groups of people? Let's offer a subscription service to our product, but on behalf of people in Australia who need it. So customers that might have gone through menopause, or people that don't bleed, or might be on the marine or a contraception that means they don't have their own period, they can subscribe to our product, but it lands in the hands of women in Australia who needs it. And the way that's done is through our local partnerships with organisations in Australia.
Wonderful project. You are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, anti-discrimination and harassment consultant Brent Sanders, editor at the Weekend Australian Christine Medap, in Melbourne law student Avia Sanders, and in Brisbane co-director of the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney, Ian Hickey. Well, their wedding might have been the must-see event of the decade, but Harry and Meghan have today upped the ratings ante, sitting down for a tell-all interview with Oprah Winfrey in California. The interview was much anticipated, but even the British press were caught off guard by some of the more incendiary revelations.
So we have in tandem the conversation of he won't be given security, he's not going to be given a title, and also concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
What?
And
who is having that conversation? There is a conversation. Hold up.
There's
Stop
several
right now.
There are several conversations.
There's a
about
conversation with you,
with Harry,
about how dark your baby is going to be.
Potentially, and what that would mean or look like.
Ooh.
At the time, it was awkward. I was a bit shocked.
Can you tell us what the question was?
No, I'm not comfortable sharing that.
Okay.
But that was right at the beginning, right?
Like, what will the baby look like?
Yeah, what will the kids look like?
Yeah, what will the kids look like?
As well as that, the 2-hour interview included a confession from Meghan that the experience of trying to fit into the royal family had left her feeling suicidal.
Look, I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry, especially, because I know how much loss he's suffered.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it, and I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
Christine, it was an extraordinary interview. Meghan talking there about suicidal feelings and depression and asking for help and not getting it. And I just wonder whether or not, you know, this is maybe everything that people have suspected about the royal family, that it's a pretty, I guess, ruthless institution.
I think we knew that, and we certainly knew that from the Diana years. But I think laying it out so baldly is something we've not really seen before. And in a way, I think it just takes us back full circle to where we started the discussion about a generation of men and women in this case who are actually not prepared to be quiet anymore. They're not prepared to just suck it up, to move on, to just accept things the way they are. They don't have to use their voice in this way. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people are wishing they didn't use their voice in this way. But the fact they have, I think, says something about where we're at the moment in society, that people are in fact going to call things out, they're not going to accept it, and it's going to be pretty ugly for a lot of people.
Avia, a woman of colour gets to the top of this feudal institution, right, the royal family, and she's still treated as a second-class citizen, she says to us, on the basis of her colour.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely horrifying, right? Because you have, you know, when I first heard the news, it was a lot, look, the royal family, you know, it's nothing to do with me. But when you look into it, the implications become even more horrifying. Because here you have Meghan Markle, a woman of color, being bullied out of a racist institution. And this is something that happens every day to millions of women, right? And Meghan Markle is... has a certain level of privilege in that she has the wealth of her position, the influence, and of course Prince Harry on her side. But think about all the women of color who face this sort of discrimination in their daily lives and in their workplace, who don't have access to that same level of, you know, media access, or, you know, the ability to incite that same sort of outrage and publicity that Meghan Markle can.
How do women of colour get bullied out of institutions?
Well, I mean, I think, so when Meghan Markle enters such, you know, predominantly white institution, she's immediately felt to feel like an outsider, right? Her entire existence is othered, especially, you know, surrounding the birth of her child, these insinuations that she's tainted the royal bloodline. And although it may not be as explicit with women of color in, you know, the workplace, there is definitely still an element of feeling othered because, you know, as we were talking about with the double glazed ceiling, you have that sort of the aspect of, you know, any sort of misogyny you might face, as well as that added brunt of racism or xenophobia or, you know, the like.
Brent, Harry said when Harry joined the interview, so it starts with Meghan, and she says these extraordinary things about feeling trapped in the palace and that she didn't have access to her passport or keys or whatever, and she felt really quite trapped. She felt suicidal. There were questions about the baby skin. She says about asking for help and not getting it for fear of damaging the institution. And then you've got this breakdown apparently in the relationship between Harry and his father, that he talks about quite openly, that at one point Charles wasn't returning his calls. I mean, I don't know whether that seems terribly sad, and it seems terribly sad in this day and age for young people. He says his father's trapped and William's trapped as well, to be trapped by expectations.
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. I mean, I can't speak for young Harry, obviously, but the move that he's made is a dramatic move, and he, no doubt, it's caused some drama between his brother, who they always appear to be very close. But those expectations, it's interesting, isn't it? I think, perhaps a micronism of that, to take it back to even what we've been talking about earlier, is I often when I'm chatting to young men in the schools, I'll say to them, guys, often the poor choices that you'll make can be a direct result of being more afraid of losing face in front of your friends than your awareness or fear of the consequences. And I think some young men, and it's not an excuse, it's not dumbing it down, act out, do things because they're more afraid of what will my peers say if I don't do it, rather than what are the consequences if I do. And so I think, I think there's a crossover between that description from Harry and perhaps how perhaps many young men feel.
It was horrifying, Ian. I think it was Harry who said that the response to, certainly the response they say they got from the institution to Meghan saying that she really was struggling and needed mental health assistance was, look, this is how it is and that might damage the institution. And I was just listening to Brent then thinking, well, is that what stiff upper lip is? Fear of losing face?
Well, it's an institution, and perhaps more important in this case, a family that isn't shifting. I think we're lucky in this country that a lot of attitudes have shifted towards mental health, towards an awareness of these issues. But if you are trapped in a situation where you feel helpless, and particularly a young woman in this situation feeling helpless in that regard, then it's risky. But I think we have in the wider world seen those shifts, and I think we're fortunate in Australia in many ways, we have seen those shifts. But people are still very reliant on what's happening in their own microcosm, in their own family, their own social groups. And that social group pressure for good, to support people, to get help, to provide it, or if it prevents it in different communities. And we've seen that in a range of different communities, and different diverse communities aren't always supportive of people getting the help they need.
Well, there's little doubt that the royal family will be left reeling from Harry and Meghan's TV confessional, but the event is also providing rich fodder for royal commentators. Now, in the lead-up to the interview, 4 of the most prominent royal analysts in the UK were approached for comment. But here's the catch. The approach was made by YouTube pranksters Josh Peters and Archie Manners, and the commentators were asked to air their views about the interview days before any of them had even seen the interview.
You've not seen the interview yet, have you?
No.
No, great. I think we have a fair idea of where the interview's going.
You do, definitely.
In the interview, to my mind, this was an actress giving one of her great performances. From start to finish, Meghan was acting.
But this was an extremely hard-hitting interview.
She did ask the tough questions. She had to ask the tough questions.
It was not a balanced interview.
To hear her talking about members of the royal family didn't surprise me at all.
In describing the brotherly rift, as they did in the interview, you can't help but be incredibly moved.
I think what it said is Meghan's relationship with the royal household was not very good.
The interview told us that Harry and Meghan both greatly admire the Queen.
In the interview, the nicest thing about Meghan was that she, it's her love of animals.
She does have a love of animals, but that's only one side of her. That's a domestic side.
Yeah.
We've got to look at the broad picture.
Gotcha. The Victorian government has acknowledged the need for root and branch reform of its mental health system after it was found that services have catastrophically failed to live up to expectations for decades. Last week's Royal Commission report highlighted that the suffering is particularly acute for young people. Last year, a survey by Headspace found that 26% of young men and 40% of young women aged between 12 and 25 reported high or very high psychological distress. That's compared to 6% for adult men and 13% for women, reported in 2007. Honor Eastley co-founded peer initiative support initiative The Big Fields Club and was a member of the advisory committee for the Royal Commission. She's made a podcast detailing her experience of trying to navigate the system.
At the moment in the mental health system, it's really at one end, there's your GP, there's some sessions with a psychologist. At the other end, there is hospital, inpatient. In the middle of those two things is not a lot.
The vast wasteland where people are struggling but not psychotic, struggling but not violent, struggling but not suicidal enough. Not suicidal enough. Such a shitty place to be.
What is really confronting is to be told to ask for help and then to find that actually the process of trying to find that help is really difficult. You know, for me personally, I've spent hours on hold to crisis lines. I've been on a 9-month wait list before. I did actually end up going to hospital. And I said in the podcast I made with the ABC that it felt like hospital isn't a place where you go and get better. It's a place where you go and you don't die.
But instead of thinking this system was clearly inadequate, I started to think that I must be a particularly bad problem, a stain on an otherwise helpful system. You know, that's what all the ads said. The key is just asking for help.
That's one of the things that we often talk about with the Big Fields Club, is that sometimes the answer is actually just finding other people that are asking the same questions as you. And we know that for lots of other aspects of life. We do a lot of different projects, but it's all centered around how can people have more experiences meeting other people who have been through similar things. We don't just want every step along the way and then to hospital. We also want alternatives to hospital, and we want choice and we want control over the type of support we get. So what's been really great to see in the report is that there's a few key strategic leadership positions that are designated for people with lived experience who've been through this, who've used the system. That's really positive to see. We need to make sure that it's central to all of the redesign.
So Ian, if I can start with you, we're hearing these stories over and over of young people and their parents and carers, and they don't know where to go and they don't know what to do. They're stuck in what Honor's calling that wasteland.
So despite 30 years of a national mental health strategy, now what we have is a Victorian Royal Commission which says, guess what? And a Premier saying, guess what? It's fundamentally broken. And where it's broken most is around young people with those more complex problems as was just being described, and then having to fall back on a hospital system which is an acute emergency system that is not connected with significant ongoing care. So it's not surprising that people don't know where to go, because they don't know a lot of other people who've been able to go through a system and describe accurately how care was, how good it was, how it helped them to get back to school or get back to work or get their lives back under control again. So many, many people, particularly young people, have stories about contacts with care that were unsatisfactory, didn't resolve the problems, didn't connect them with a style of care that would actually make a difference. So, you know, this time around, and I must say I've been associated with reports myself for the last 25 years that say this is the problem. And in fact, sadly, amongst young people, with increased awareness, but also changes, particularly as has been the theme today, particularly changes for younger women, we're seeing more of these problems, but we have never built a system fit for purpose to respond effectively and quickly. I've just spent the last week in regional Australia, in northern New South Wales. The lack of services, particularly outside of our cities, for people who are really in trouble is overwhelming. And so this time around, we really do need cooperation at all levels of government that puts people at the centre to meet their needs quickly and then effectively ongoing where those problems are complex.
Brent, you hear stories, now you're in schools every week, right? And you hear stories from parents saying, do we just keep turning up at emergency until we can get some help? And these aren't people struggling with English as a second language. These aren't people necessarily struggling with resources. And what happens to those people? What happens in regional areas?
Look, it's a really good question, and I think, and you know, Ian, I defer to his expertise in this space, but you know, Australia, comparatively speaking, we sadly have a very high rate of sexual crime. We have a high rate of, I think, Ian, suicide amongst adolescent males and things like that, comparatively.
Is that right, Ian?
Yes. We think we're gold medal winners. We talk about the best health system. In fact, in the suicide and mental health space, we're very average. We're not even on the podium for close finishes, you know, and that's because of the nature of Australia, the regionality in certain groups, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, lower socioeconomic groups in the outer suburbs of our cities. We don't distribute care equally. Many people don't even get close to the best available care.
Christine, would you have a sense of what to do when you talk about it in your community? Because it comes up in every community.
It's in every community, and overwhelmingly what I hear is that there is nowhere to go. So even in Sydney, I have watched very good friends deal with suicidal children who cannot get help for their children. And I find that unbelievable in this country that we cannot find help, basic help, for these children. And then I talk to friends in regional areas who have a flood of parents very worried parents bringing their children in, and they have nowhere to refer those people to. So how hopeless is that we don't even have that first step of referring, let alone then getting treatment? I mean, it is unbelievable in this country that we're even talking about this lack of service.
Avia, you talk to me. I mean, you were very vocal last year talking about the impact in that HSC year of being locked down in Victoria and the impact on your friends. What's your experience of this?
Well, look, when you're already isolated, feeling quite lonely and experiencing those feelings of depression, when you're, you know, that is compounded by COVID-19, where you're not able to see your friends and you don't have access to that support network you normally might. And the thing is, when you're going through one of those depressive episodes, calling up a lifeline, you know, organizing an appointment with a GP and then a referral to a psychiatrist can be incredibly taxing and draining. So we get a lot of resources from school where it's like mental health reminders, drink a glass of water, go outside. And of course, that's good advice, but it just doesn't feel like quite enough. I've had friends who went to the GP to book an appointment for a psychiatrist because they were struggling with their mental health. But some of them have been told, look, you know, it's not that bad. You know, you're too young to really be feeling these things. And basically, they were just sort of cut off when they were actually looking for help.
Oh, Ian.
It is shocking in this day and age, the sort of stories that are happening every day of the week. And I say it is absolutely true in central Sydney. I work in those areas where we see people turned away from emergency departments in central and northern and eastern Sydney every day of the week. We have not set up the pathways. The thing is, there are solutions. They need to be well organised at the regional level, and then the funding and coordination mechanisms need to follow. We're seeing in the face of COVID, I must say, what happens when a dysfunctional system hits a crisis, just like aged care. What you find out is what wasn't working is now amplified. So all the modelling we've been associated with shows that for women, for young people, for those in rural and regional Australia, there are really additional pressures. So this requires urgent action. I mean, we now do have a new assistant minister assisting the Prime Minister in David Coleman. There's more discussion about what needs to be done, but actions, real actions need to take place this year that are smart, 21st century and organised into the future. We don't need many more inquiries. We sure need real action on the ground.
But it seems, Christine, that tomorrow we're going to talk about the Aged Care Royal Commission, and there's a call for billions of dollars to ensure that we have dignified lives for our elders.
Yes.
And safe. And this is another call for literally billions of dollars. I mean, in Victoria alone, 3.3 million more hours needed of community mental health and wellbeing. That's the gap, 3.3 million hours. And one assumes that there aren't the psychiatrists and psychologists and infrastructure to just deal with that.
No, and so there needs to be an examination of that. But some of that money, I sort of find that a lot of the money goes into the early stage of the process, which is great. So it's around the education and communication process, right? So there is help out there, call this number, it's in all the messaging. But the reality is you call the number or you get the help and there's nothing to follow it up. So in a way, we sort of front-loaded the system, which is great because it means we're talking about it and we're telling people that there is, you know, help at hand, but we're not providing the help at hand. So there needs to be the second and third stage of delivery.
Ian, just really quickly on this one, because I want to bring it back to Brent. Are things getting worse for younger people? Is this a reflection of COVID in Victoria, or are things getting worse in terms of a trend?
So there was a trend pre-COVID right across Australia, but also across the developed world, particularly of worsening mental health, and particularly self-harm, in younger groups, particularly younger women in the 10 to 15 age group. So things were declining pre-COVID, but they're definitely exacerbated by COVID. And government policies in education, in employment, in support really need to be focused on the bigger picture for young people, but then the services safety net absolutely needs to be in place. So following up people after suicide attempts, taking the pressure off emergency departments, those pathways of care in the community need to be clear. There are solutions. So while we need money into that which works, not money into systems that have already failed. And more awareness campaigns and more helplines are definitely not the answer.
Are you clear what happens, Brent, when someone discloses to you after, you know, half a day when you're in a school and you've been talking about rape and consent and all the rest of it, and they're triggered by that, and they come and disclose to you that something terrible's happened?
Well, the schooling system operates under mandatory reporting for things such as that. And so there are a lot of checks and balances in place. Mandatory reporting came at about 95, 96. There's a downside to it as well, because it can also prevent people from coming forward because they don't want the mandatory reporting process. But the one thing I would say in schools particularly is I think that they are quite well set up to be that first point of contact for these children. That you could always have more counselling stuff, but it's better now than what it used to be in many areas that I've noticed. I used to speak to counsellors who would look after 3 high schools and 2 primary schools on their own, you know, where now I'm often dealing with somebody there, my point of contact at the school. So I think the initial contact between the student, teacher, student to counsellor, I think it is good. Now, what happens from that point forward? I guess there's going to be obviously hiccups and variations there. But schools, for mine, do quite a good job at that first step of wrapping themselves around that student and providing options and opportunities, and possibly being a go-between between the student and parents, and then where they can seek other help.
So, Ian, the tagline on some of these recommendations is local early, not hospital late. Invest in young people early. What makes a difference in advice to anyone watching tonight if they're dealing particularly with a young person in distress and they can't get help?
So there's no doubt that coming forward with healthcare is important, but young people often need parents, people who know the system, people who can work the system, to push the system locally to provide care, and quality care at that. I mean, a lot of the education work, as Brent was just emphasising, is very good, but it's not then connected with healthcare. So young people need advocates, they need supporters, they need families, while the system sorts this out to say, hey, it's not okay just to leave me half done and say that's enough. When
can't see a psychiatrist for 6 months, can't see a psychiatrist till you're 16, can't get any residential care till next year. What do you say to that?
Well, all of us have to say, forget it, that is not good enough. We've got to put solutions on the ground in each of the regions of Australia over the next 12 months, and no longer accept that in mental health, that's what we'll settle for. We don't accept that in cancer care, we don't accept that in heart care, we don't accept that in infectious diseases. You can clearly see by the way we're responding to COVID. We've got to say it's as unacceptable in mental health as all those other areas.
Yeah.
People can make differences when you prioritise the area.
And if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline 131114 or Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636. That's all we have time for tonight. Thanks so much to our panel, to Brent, to Christine, Avia and Ian Hickey in Brisbane. Have a great evening, and I'll be back with you tomorrow night. Good night to you.
People want to feel connected. They want to believe in each other.
If you have to buy a lemon, you haven't got any friends.
I've lived in Strathfield for the past 30